The Appalachian Gravedigger too disturbing for history books. Solomon Vance, 47. You think you understand what a gravedigger does. You have pictured the work, the shovel, the clay, the measured rectangle cut into cold ground before first light so that the family does not have to watch the preparation. The quiet labor of closing what other people could not bear to close themselves. That is a job that carries weight, and most men who carry it long enough are shaped by it in ways that are visible if you look. They get quieter. They get more deliberate. Some of them, people say, get strange, but strange in the way that spending your working life adjacent to death will make a man strange. A strangeness that is explicable, that follows from the circumstances. Solomon Vance of Carter County, Tennessee, was 47 years old when his neighbors finally understood that what had shaped him was not the weight of the work. It was the discovery, early in his career, that the work did not have to stop at the closing. That there were things you could do after the earth was replaced that no minister, no family member, no county official would ever think to look for. Because the assumption that communities make about a sealed grave, the assumption that all of social life around death is built upon, is that once the earth is back in place, the matter is concluded. Solomon Vance built an entire second life on that assumption for 20 years, and no one looked. Before we go further, drop your location in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from tonight, because what follows is a case that will permanently change the way you think about the men who tend the dead in small communities, and about what closed ground can be made to hold. Carter County, Tennessee sits in the northeast corner of the state, pressed into the Blue Ridge where the Doe River cuts through rock so ancient that the geological surveys of the 1890s struggled to date it with confidence. The community of Elk Park, where Solomon Vance lived and worked, was a small settlement of farming and timbering families who shared, as most Appalachian communities of that period shared, a deep and practiced relationship with death. Children died of fever, men died in logging accidents and mine falls, women died in childbirth at rates the mountain communities had long since absorbed as the ambient cost of living where they lived. This meant that the local gravedigger, the man who maintained the church cemetery, who was called on to prepare a plot when a family could not do it themselves, who knew every corner of that ground the way a farmer knows a field, was a figure of consistent necessity and quiet authority. People deferred to him on matters of the cemetery the way they deferred to the blacksmith on matters of iron. His domain was not questioned because questioning it required engaging with a subject that most people preferred to manage through ritual and leave alone afterward. Solomon Vance had held that role since his late 20s. He was a tall man, lean in the way of men who work outdoors through all seasons, with hands permanently darkened by soil regardless of how carefully he washed, the staining that goes past the surface after enough years. His eyes were gray-green, the color of lichen on old limestone. He spoke carefully and without excess. He lived alone in a small frame house at the edge of the Elk Park Cemetery grounds, provided to him by the church congregation as part of his arrangement, a practical decision that kept the caretaker close to what he cared for. The back windows of his house looked directly over the older section of graves. He had lived there for 20 years. He knew that ground the way a man knows a room he has spent his entire adult life inside. He was known in the community as reliable, which is what communities say about men who do necessary work without complaint and without requiring supervision. He dug when asked. He maintained the paths and the drainage. He replaced fallen markers. He kept records, a practice the church board had formally asked him to begin in 1891 when the congregation decided the cemetery needed a proper accounting of all interments. The board believed the record journal contained what it had asked for: names, dates of death, dates of interment, plot locations. They had never read it in full. They had asked him to keep it, and he had kept it, and the assumption was that it contained what it was supposed to contain. It contained considerably more than that. The first indication that something was wrong came from a woman named Bertha Landon, whose mother had died in the spring of 1904 and been buried in the Elk Park Cemetery, with the full service and the full community in attendance. Bertha visited her mother's grave regularly, weekly through the first year, then monthly. By the late summer of 1904, she had noticed that the soil over the grave was inconsistent in a way she could not explain and could not stop thinking about. The mound had settled over the months since burial in the progressive way that all graves settle, a process Bertha had observed before with other graves, and which followed a pattern she understood intuitively. That pattern had been interrupted. The ground above her mother had been disturbed and repacked. She was certain of it. The settling had been reset. She told her husband. He told her she was mistaken, that grief did things to perception, that ground shifted and settled in ways that could look intentional without being so. She did not accept this. She had been watching carefully enough and long enough to know the difference. She brought him back and showed him. He became less certain. Together, they went to the deacon. The church board, composed of practical men with no experience of what they were beginning to contemplate, went to Solomon Vance and asked him directly, had he opened any graves in the Elk Park Cemetery in the preceding months for any reason? Drainage repair? A marker problem? Anything legitimate that would account for what Bertha Landon had observed? Vance said no. Without hesitation, without any sign of a man being caught at something, he said the grave had not been touched since its closing, and offered to show them his records. He showed them the record journal. The journal showed only what the congregation had asked him to record. The board thanked him and returned to Bertha Landon with a verdict of no evidence of disturbance. They told her that settling patterns could appear irregular. They meant well. They were wrong. Bertha Landon did not accept the verdict. She was 38 years old, a woman who had grown up in that county and had helped bury 3 siblings before reaching adulthood. She knew what disturbed earth looked like, and she was not going to be told otherwise by men who had never watched a grave long enough to see it. She hired a man named Curtis Barker, a farmer from the next hollow over with no connection to the church board or to Vance, and asked him to watch the cemetery at night for 2 weeks in September 1904. She paid him from her own household money. On the 9th night, Curtis Barker saw Solomon Vance emerge from his house at approximately 2 a.m. carrying a lantern and a short-handled shovel. Vance walked directly across the cemetery without looking around him, without any indication that he believed himself to be doing something he needed to do in secret, and proceeded to a grave in the older section, not Bertha Landon's mother's grave, a different one, and began to open it with a methodical efficiency that suggested considerable practice. Barker left immediately to collect Bertha Landon's husband and the deacon. They returned within the hour. Vance was still at the grave. He was not attempting to conceal himself. He looked up at their lanterns coming across the cemetery and waited for them to reach him. When the deacon told him to stop and step away, Vance set down his shovel with the patience of a man interrupted at something he intended to return to, and stepped back from the edge of the grave. He said, "I will answer your questions in the morning. I am not finished here." What they found in the open grave was not what any of them had been prepared to find. The body interred there, a man named Orrin Tull, who had died the previous year, had been accessed on prior occasions. The stratification of the soil below the surface showed the layered compression of ground opened and resealed more than once. Objects had been placed alongside the original occupant, placed with deliberate care rather than dropped or discarded. Objects that the deacon documented in a written statement submitted to the Carter County Sheriff the following morning as personal effects that did not belong to Orrin Tull. Items that appeared to have come from other graves in the cemetery, and items that appeared to have come from among the living. Vance's house was searched the following morning with the sheriff present. The full record journal was examined for the first time in its entirety. The section the congregation had requested occupied less than a third of the book. The remaining 2/3 were in the same hand, written more densely, organized into columns that documented something the men examining it could not fully decode. Entries that appeared to record what Vance had placed in which graves on which dates, cross-referenced with symbols none of them could interpret, accompanied by annotations that appeared to describe expected outcomes over specific time intervals. The journal had the internal structure of a long-term experimental record, maintained with the care of a man who expected his observations to accumulate into something meaningful. The county physician, a man named Dr. Elmore Fitch, who had practiced in Carter County for 18 years, examined the disturbed graves and submitted a written assessment to the court marked confidential. What is known of its contents comes from a single sentence in the sheriff's private log, donated to the local historical society in 1961 by Fitch's daughter. Fitch says he cannot explain what he observed in the graves in terms his training provides, and that his best description of the condition of those interments is that something has been in progress that the condition of the remains does not permit him to name within a medical framework. Fitch declined to give oral testimony at trial. He submitted a written statement. That statement is in the sealed portion of the trial record. 11 graves in the Elk Park Cemetery were identified as having been accessed by Vance during his tenure. The church board voted in 1906 to exhume and re-inter all 11, a process carried out over 2 weeks in the summer of that year. The minister who oversaw the work, a man named Josiah Carver, wrote afterward to the church's regional council that the process was complete and that he considered the matter closed to the extent that human effort could close it. He added that he would not be describing the specifics of what had been found in those graves in any letter or communication, and asked the council to trust his judgment that the less that was put into writing about this matter, the better for everyone involved. Vance was tried in 1905 on charges of unlawful interference with a corpse, the most applicable available statute. He was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in the state penitentiary. He served 3 years with a reduction for conduct and was released in 1908. He did not return to Carter County. He does not appear in census or vital records for Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, or Kentucky in any year through 1930. No death record for him has been found. The record journal was retained as trial evidence. After the trial, it disappeared. A 1901 courthouse inventory notes it as present. A subsequent inventory from 1918 does not include it. When a researcher identified this discrepancy in 2001, the county clerk had no explanation and suggested it may have been transferred to state storage. The Tennessee State Library and Archives has no record of receiving it. The Elk Park Cemetery is still active. The church was rebuilt and rededicated in 1922. The older section, the section where Solomon Vance worked for 20 years, is maintained alongside the newer sections, without distinction. The graves from his tenure are still there. The stones show 120 years of weathering. No one tends them with any particular attention. No one avoids them with any particular intention. They are simply part of the ground, which is exactly what Solomon Vance understood about them, and about the assumption that communities make when they seal a grave, and about everything that assumption permits a patient and methodical man to accomplish if he has 20 years, a house with a back window over the old section, and a journal no one thought to read in full. Here is the question I want to stay with you. Vance served 3 years and was released. He was never found again. Do you believe that a man with that level of systematic practice over 20 years simply stops when the circumstances that enabled it are removed? Or do you believe that wherever he went after 1908 he found the nearest cemetery and, when the opportunity presented itself, found his way back to the work he understood better than any other? Drop your answer below. Some records disappear because they are unimportant. Some disappear because whoever held them last looked carefully at what they contained and decided that the fewer hands those pages pass through, the better. If this is the kind of darkness that stays with you, subscribe. There are more cases like this one. Keep your doors locked and your eyes open. There is a detail about Solomon Vance that most accounts of this case overlook because it sits in an unremarkable part of the court record and requires knowing what to look for in order to see it. During his 3 years in the penitentiary, Vance was given access to the prison library as a matter of routine. The prison librarian at the time, a man named Joseph Aldwell, who kept meticulous records of borrowing, noted in his annual report for 1907 that one prisoner, identified only by number, but cross-referenced to Vance's file by a researcher in 1988, had repeatedly requested texts on botany, on the treatment of soil and decomposition, and on what Aldwell's report called obscure ecclesiastical history of a nature the librarian described as not suitable for general recommendation. Aldwell noted that the prisoner read these materials with an attention and speed that suggested prior familiarity. He noted that the prisoner took no notes because note-taking was not permitted. He noted that the prisoner returned the books without visible hesitation each time, as though the information had already been absorbed and the physical volume was no longer needed. The texts Vance was reading in 1907 were preparation of some kind. Whether preparation for what he had been doing in Elk Park before his arrest, or preparation for what he intended to do wherever he went when he left in 1908, is not a question the prison record can answer. What the record can answer is that 3 years of incarceration did not interrupt whatever it was Vance was working toward. He used the time. He arrived better informed at the end of it than he had been at the beginning. He walked out of the penitentiary in 1908 and vanished into a country where a man without roots could disappear completely. He was 47 years old. He was experienced. He understood that cemeteries are maintained by caretakers that communities trust implicitly, and that trust, once extended, is rarely withdrawn until the damage is already decades old. If he worked for another 20 years, he worked in a town whose name has never been connected to his. He worked in a cemetery where no one knew his history. He worked with the same methodical care and the same long-view patience he had applied in Elk Park, and if the warning signs appeared, the Bertha Landons with their careful eyes at their family graves, he would have recognized them early enough to move on before anyone gathered enough certainty to act. He may have worked in a cemetery you have visited. He may have tended a grave you stood at. He is, in all probability, in the ground now himself, in some county that has no knowledge of what its soil may be holding on his account. That is the part of the Solomon Vance case that the official record, with its thin charges and its missing journal and its 3-year sentence, was not designed to sit with. You do not have to let it go just because the record did. One last thing. Bertha Landon, the woman who started all of this, who refused to accept the board's explanation, who hired Curtis Barker with her own money, who stood in a cemetery at 3 a.m. with a deacon and her husband and watched the thing she had known she was watching be confirmed. Bertha Landon's own grave is in the Elk Park Cemetery. She died in 1931. She is in the newer section, not the older one. She is not in any of the 11 graves that Vance accessed. Whether she knew that, whether in her remaining years she kept watching the ground above her parents and her neighbors and the people she had grown up beside, watching to make sure the settling stayed settled, the record does not say. What the record says is that she is there. In the ground. In the same cemetery. 100 yards from the section where Solomon Vance worked for 20 years and never once needed to explain himself to anyone until the 9th night. The older section is still quiet. The fieldstones are still weathering. And somewhere in a county no archive has connected to his name, Solomon Vance is in the ground too, having done whatever he spent his last decades doing, in whatever cemetery trusted him the way Elk Park trusted him before Bertha Landon started watching.